Hi folks, I recently posted a short video on YouTube regarding LEOSA and how many times a year I think you should qualify with your firearm if you want to carry under LEOSA in New Jersey. And of course, I recommended twice a year. Now, I just wanted to clarify a few things because I have been receiving some feedback on this video. And I know there's been debate for a long time about LEOSA in New Jersey and how many times a year you have to qualify. A lot of guys think it's once a year the way it's written, and other guys think that it's twice a year because that's the standard for active duty law enforcement in New Jersey. So in my video, I talk about Title 18 U.S. Code 926C, which details the requirements for qualified retired law enforcement officers to carry under LEOSA. Initially, when you read it, at least when I initially read it, I can see where you might think, oh, this means once a year. If you read it again, and I know LEOSA has been amended at least twice to include other law enforcement officers that weren't included in the original HR 218, and I don't think that the language for qualification was changed. I think the language for definition of a firearm was added in one of the amendments. I don't think the qualification language was changed, but if it was changed, so if somebody knows that, please let me know or put that in the comment section. And I'm not an attorney, but the way I read it is within the most recent 12-month period. And I think that's where a lot of guys say, well, that means once a year. It says within the most recent 12-month period. You must use the standards, qualify under the standards of either your former agency, the state in which you retired, assuming you live there, or under the active law enforcement officers or agency of the state you live in currently, or if they don't have a standard, then you need to get with a firearms instructor who qualifies active duty law enforcement officers and have them qualify you. So the issue isn't whether it's the standard for your active duty officers. The issue is how many times a year do you have to do this. So the way I read that within most recent 12-month period is that's a currency thing to me. They want you to be current, in my opinion. So for example, if you retired 5 years ago and you qualified before you retired, that's not good enough. 5 years ago is too long. It's got to be recent. It's got to be in the most recent 12-month period. That's how I read that. It doesn't mean to me, well, use the standard, but only do it once, because I don't see the word once in there, and I don't see the word annual in there. And if I saw those two words, I think I'd feel better about saying, yes, for sure, LEOSA, that means once a year for New Jersey. Because they don't use those words. They say use the standard for active duty law enforcement in your state. And the standard, as we all know, in New Jersey currently is twice a year. It's part of the standard. And some guys say, well, by standard, they mean course of fire, day, night. They mean that sort of thing. They mean how many rounds down the range and how many targets and distance and all that. I think that's true, but I also think for New Jersey law enforcement, it's also twice a year. That's part of the standard. In fact, the Attorney General's office even calls it the semi-annual qualification standard. So it's part of our standard in New Jersey. That's how I interpret it. So because they left out once a year or annual, in my opinion, either Congress did this on purpose or it was an oversight and it should be clarified, along with many other things I think that need to be clarified in LEOSA. If they left it out on purpose or left that language the way it is on purpose, that's because they wanted to leave it up to the states. So they could have created a whole new qualification standard for LEOSA, or they could have used the federal standard that the FBI and the DEA use, and they could have said, if you want to carry under LEOSA, use this federal standard. But they didn't do that. I think they didn't want to go down that road because they know there are so many different agencies across the United States, and they didn't want to create a whole new process. So they just said, you know what? Use whatever standard your active duty law enforcement uses in the state where you retire from or where you currently live. So that was much easier to them. But they didn't, in my opinion, specify a frequency. So that goes along to me with your active duty agency's standard. And again, in New Jersey, that's twice a year. Now, again, I know a lot of people don't agree with me, and that's fine. That's how I interpret it. That's how I read the code. And I'm not telling guys to do something that they don't think they need to do. If you read that and we're all retired law enforcement, whoever is carrying under LEOSA, you have to be retired law enforcement. So everyone knows their abilities. Everyone knows how to use firearms. It's a matter of, what do you feel comfortable with? So if you interpret that, to me, if you interpret that as once a year, then by all means, I'm not telling you that you're wrong. I'm just saying that that's not how I read it. The bottom line is, if you get involved in a shooting under LEOSA and they see that you qualified 11 months ago, 11 months and 2 weeks ago, are you going to get jammed up? Probably not, especially if it's a good shoot, right? You're probably not going to get jammed up. And even if you do get jammed up, in the end, I think you turn out okay, especially with the recent NYSERPA versus Bruin. I think a lot of stuff's going to get challenged with firearms and firearms restrictions in New Jersey and other states. So chances are, you'd be okay with once a year. So I'm not saying do this or else. I'm just saying this is how I read the code. And if you're an attorney and you're seeing this video and you want to weigh in, feel free to leave a comment. I welcome any comments. Please, in fact, I encourage them because I know there's a lot of different opinions out there. So please leave them below. Also, I should note that shooting twice a year as opposed to once a year is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we can all use the practice, right? But that being said, again, we're all grown men and women and we're all retired law enforcement. We know our abilities with firearms. So you might be very comfortable with firearms. You might be very proficient with a firearm. You might be able to go a year or two without firing it and still draw it and fire it and be very accurate. Other guys might want to shoot 2 or 3 times a year to feel comfortable carrying. So it's your decision, and I'm not trying to say that you need to do this or else. I'm just offering my opinion on how I interpret the code as I read it. And again, there are other areas of LEOSA. So the qualification requirement, in my opinion, is not the only area of LEOSA that needs to be revised or amended. This has been going on since the inception and since it's been amended, but magazine restriction for one. And I don't think Congress intended to have these restrictions as a result when they initially wrote this bill. So why should law enforcement, in my opinion, retired law enforcement, there should be no restriction on magazine capacity. But New Jersey, 3 years ago, passed a law that amended the magazine capacity to 10 rounds. So that applies to everyone except active duty police officers and retired police officers only if you get the RPO and you have your up to 15 round weapon registered with the state police, which all that means is it's got to be on your qualification sheet. With the magazine restriction, I've talked to some guys who say, well, if the firearm's approved, then whatever magazine comes with that firearm is acceptable. So if it's a Glock 19, like I have, 15 round magazine, that's acceptable under LEOSA. And that may be true, but LEOSA doesn't address magazine capacity. At least I didn't read it in there. So maybe they should have. Maybe they should have put a little blurb in there that in spite of, notwithstanding any state law regarding magazine restriction, because I personally don't think law enforcement or retired law enforcement should be restricted by the magazine capacity. But it's not addressed in LEOSA. So if you want to interpret it as, well, firearms are addressed, and if it goes with my firearm, then I'm covered. Yeah, probably. It's probably true. And if you got involved in a shooting and you had a 15 round magazine in your weapon in New Jersey and you didn't have an RPO, would you be okay? I think you would in the end, especially with NYSERPA versus Bruin. I think you would be okay in the end. But would it mean you'd have to go through court and you'd have to fight and you'd have to get an attorney? And because does it mean they're going to charge you with having a 15 round magazine? Maybe. But I think in the end you would be okay. But I don't think that Congress intended to restrict retired police officers from carrying in, say, schools. I have kids that are in school, and why shouldn't I be able to carry when I go pick them up at school? Like, that's absurd to me because there are mass shootings at schools. There are mass shootings in parks and playgrounds. And so I think the intent of Congress was to not restrict retired and active duty police officers as to not restrict them as much as possible. these are areas of LEOSA that need to be addressed. And I do think that when they do that, I hope that they put a little bit more clarification in the language for qualification, because again, it doesn't use that once a year or annual. It says in the most recent 12-month period, and that to me is a currency thing, and it doesn't mean annual to me. It's a currency thing. Love to hear your thoughts on this, comments, opinions, if you want to leave that below. And again, hopefully when LEOSA is revamped or amended, hopefully they're going to clarify the qualification as well as the other issues that I think a lot of retired law enforcement officers hope that they do. So it's a little more clear for people when they carry. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Take care and stay safe.